Hello, and welcome to the Simply Human YouTube channel and podcast. Hi, Karen. How are you doing?
Oh, Christy, I'm so excited to talk about this topic. I love that we're talking about the dominant, introverted sensing memory emotion because a lot of my clients are in that category. So I'm so excited to talk some more
Yes,
and learn
yeah.
more about it.
We've had a lot of conversations about this, so this will be really fun to share with people. So we're going to do a real quick recap on what this series is about. So we have been talking about the cognitive functions identified by Carl Jung. And what I mean by that is this is processing hardwiring that we're born with on just two particular aspects of cognitive processing. One is how we orient towards information, whether we orient outward or whether we are processing internally, and also how we make decisions and the cognitive processing around organizing the data we collect, and then how we make judgments on how we collect that data. And these aspects of cognitive processing really influence aspects of our personality. And there is a lot in human behavior that's actually pretty predictable. But when we talk about interpersonal reactions, these differences, they can either be compatible or they can end up being in a clash where there's a lot of misunderstanding and judgment. And then here's the good news. Because the brain continues to grow as we age, granted, it grows really rapidly when we're younger. And then after around age 26, 28, 29, it does start to slow down, but it's called neuroplasticity. So although what we're talking about is about your dominant, like kind of how you were born and your preferred way of processing, this doesn't mean that you can't over your lifespan develop several of these ways of processing that we're going to be talking about. So I want you to be listening to this, not just about asking yourself, does this resonate? Does this sound like me? But also, does this sound like my partner? Does this sound like my colleague? Does this sound like my child? This is to help start getting a bit of a different insight into your interpersonal interactions.
And I think it's really important in the workspace too, because of the fact that there's a high percentage of us that are really in this area of introverted sensing, which we'll get into, like 46%, right? And I think that's what's important to realize. And I didn't realize how much I'm a small percentage and how it creates an understanding that I didn't know how I can be better allies to those other people who are this introverted sensing type and vice versa as they learn what my type is. Because that's the whole point of this is that, like Christina, I love to just further your deepening your understanding because I never went to this detail that Christina is explaining. I've always went more with just, am I introverted, extroverted? Am I, thinking or am I feeling? I never went to this whole thing of this way of thinking about the cognitive functioning. And I think that's why we want you guys to pay attention to this.
Yeah, and although, folks, we've been trying to shorten our episodes, so we're not able to do the deep dive that I would like to do, but that's why we're breaking this into 8 different episodes. But we will put some resources down in the show notes. One of them is a book we mentioned last week, which is called Personality Type: An Owner's Manual by Lenore Thompson, and then a really helpful resource, and you can even do training, is from a company called Personality Hacker at personalityhacker.com. And again, I'm going to put the link down in the show notes. In terms of all that I've seen out there available on this topic, these are 2 of the best resources that I would refer people to because they really do truly understand it at this deeper level.
So before we start, though, we don't want to forget to ask to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, share, hit that notification button. So when we do new episodes, you will know right away. And for you podcast listeners, we ask you to hit the text us link with your comments and questions.
Okay, now I want to just jump in, Karen, because you jumped a little ahead and you were using some terminology that the folks haven't been exposed to yet. So let me
Oops.
catch everybody up. So Karen was mentioning this term introverted sensing. In our last episode, we talked about the function of sensing, which was the 5 senses, oriented outward, oriented in an extroverted way. So we call that extroverted sensing. Today, we're going to be talking about the perceiving process that is still sensing. So it's still based on the five senses, but it is oriented inward. It was oriented towards the memories and impressions that have been gathered by the five senses, and we call that introverted sensing. Now, if you have ever taken something at school or in your job called the Myers-Briggs Type Instrument or the MBTI, you may not even remember that name, but you remember getting something that had 4 letters and said, this is your personality type, ISTJ or ENFP. What we're talking about today is anyone who had an S and a J in that 4-letter code. So that would be, if it is your dominant preferred function, the ISTJs, the ISFJs, and if it is your secondary function, and we talked about this would be the co-pilot in the car versus the driver in the car. So if you're the co-pilot, you would have come up in that instrument with ESTJ or ESFJ. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to try to find a link for you on an online assessment so y'all can take it as we move forward and then go through a validation process. It may or may not correctly type you, and this is what we normally do. Normally give someone an assessment, but I don't necessarily validate, say, oh, it's valid because it got spit out of an algorithm. What we do is we go through this experiential process to validate that that is, in fact, how you prefer to process information. And one of the things I do experientially is we use an apple. And we mentioned it's this first part of the exercise in the last episode about using your 5 senses.
Yeah.
Karen, do you remember that? It was like how you feel the apple, you smell the apple, you look at it, and it was very detailed information because sensing that is outward focused tends to be the energy is really gathering those details. Now, when we give the apple to folks who are wired with this introverted sensing, the response is a little bit different. They're going to say, yes, the apple, it's a red apple. And maybe they're using their sensing. It's got a stem. It doesn't have a stem. They might say something, and this is where we're calling it memory in motion. They might say something like, it's the apple I got in school, okay? Because it associates to the past. So they're perceiving it, and it goes straight to memory, present to past. It's the type of apple I would get at school. It's the type of apple you used to give out at Halloween. Okay, that's very, very different from saying it's red, it has a stem, there's a sticker on it with the number 4321197. And they'll often say, oh, this is a mealy apple. They'll talk about the texture even though they haven't taken a bite. And we mentioned that when I do this in a group, the sensates in the extroverted orientation will say, how do you know you didn't bite it? Because the time orientation for sensates in the extroverted attitude is here and now. And for the introverted sensates, they'll say, because I've had it in the past, and this apple is always mealy. So I know this information about this apple because I've gathered it many, many times in the past. Therefore, this apple is mealy. And those two will start getting into a dispute about this. And Carl Jung actually observed that this same function type, sensing, but in the opposite direction, are going to have more conflict than, say, someone who is an extroverted sensate and someone like me, who's an introverted intuitive. We will be able to actually communicate better. When people do this in organization and you have someone that has the SP and another person has SJ, they'll say, oh, you're both sensing. And so it doesn't explain why there's conflict happening. But those are two very different ways of processing information, very, very different. And it can end up very frequently having conflict. And so a lot of times why people don't remember what they learned when they have that Myers-Briggs MBTI in the work environment is because they see that it's not really making sense. It's not resonating. It's not explaining things. But This is how I do it in organizations, and it brings a lot of ahas by breaking it down to this level. So the key here is that the orientation is sensory information, the impression it makes as it relates to the vast file cabinet of data gathered over
So
experience.
that's
So
the
it is
key,
a
is the time
present to past
orientation for this one.
time orientation.
That's what I love about this one, right? And I think it's interesting about the apple too, guys, because I think even if you could take an apple and think about it, how you describe it, that's what's the cool part, because it gives you a quick assessment of the type you are, correct?
If you know what you're looking for, I can hear it because I've been doing this for
Forever. Yeah,
a
20
couple of
years or
decades.
so.
Yeah, I can hear it, and I can already hear in people's language and how they're describing
Mm.
things. Like I can tell how a person is seeing the world and processing that information. And so, I mean, then that's huge. That's huge to kind of understand that bias, because I'll also know what the blind spot is. And if it's in a relationship and their partner has a different processing style, it's easy for me to see where the clash is happening or where the misunderstandings are arising. So this is why I'm referring people to really, if you're interested in this, to go to these resources that I'm providing, because it really will help you have much more knowledge and help you on this journey of self-awareness, and also being curious about the people around you so you can be more effective in that communication. And Karen, you work with a lot of folks who are introverted sensing.
Yeah, and I think the point of it is both are right, right? How I describe it, the apple is right. It's not like the other
Yeah.
person's wrong and I'm right. And I think that's something that we have to remember. And that's why it's really important that when we go in, we're not trying to determine who's right or wrong, but how can we together make a better informed decision, because we're sharing our different perspectives. And I love this way we're going to move into now, are the gifts and the challenges, because it makes me remember that their perspectives has a lot of value, because that's what allowed me to see things that I don't see, to make a
Mhm.
better decision as a decision maker, or even to better understand the situation. And I think that's what I love about how we're presenting this, instead of it just strictly, you're an E or an I, or like one
Yeah.
letter. And that's why I
It's
love the
meaningless.
combination. You kept reminding me, it's the combination of the two that's really powerful.
Yeah, it's almost meaningless. You'd have to memorize 16 different combinations, which is almost impossible.
Hmm.
It's much easier to just remember 4 ways of how we gather data
Hmm.
and 4 ways that we make decisions.
Hmm.
It's much easier. But let's kind of go on to the gifts. Does that sound good? Now, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly, but I'd love to hear from your experience where you do see it in real life. When we talk about introverted sensing, there is another model called Temperament model, and that author, Keirsey, I'm forgetting what his last name, or I think Keirsey is the last name. I'll put this link in the bottom too. It's called Please Understand Me. And he called the introverted sensate the guardian. That was sort of the label he gave for this particular processing dominance, the guardian, because one of their strengths is preserving traditions and the social norms. They're kind
Oh,
of the
I
guardians
love
of
that.
social norms.
That makes sense to me. Because I think a lot, in the workplace, they care about the past a lot and to honor the past. So it makes a lot of sense.
Well, Karen, what else culturally, like Asian cultures like China, Japan, especially Japan, has a really large population introverted sensate. And you see it in the culture. You see it on the reverence of tradition. Whereas, the United States, we also have a lot of the extroverted sensates in the here and now, like we're in the new world. What's going on here now? And that really influences our culture as well. When you have large sections of your population dominated by a particular type, it actually extends to a cultural influence, like an organization. This type is also known for being really good at conserving resources. This is the type that's thinking about, like, we're going to have a whole bunch of stuff canned and we're not going to waste, you don't waste money, very conservative about, conserving finances. This is why finance, where Karen is working, you find a lot of people with this personality type drawn to finance, because being conservative with finances is a strength. They tend to be cautious, but if it's something they have that experience, so it's in their database, they will be very confident in action, but it does depend on how much experience has accumulated. And then some of them, like the ESTJ, when you add that decisiveness, their motto is lead, follow, or get out of the way.
Yeah.
So there is this decisiveness with the extroverted version of this, ESFJ, ESTJs, where introverted sensing is the secondary. So it's the co-pilot, it's not the driver. What's driving it is, I have all this experience and I'm going to implement it now. All this experience, let's get it going. Let's get it going. We know how to do this. Let's just do it. There could be an impatience about it. Now, these types tend to like life that flows along in a stable, consistent, often linear pace. And I remember watching a coworker of mine, her type was introverted sensing with the extroverted feeling. And when she would be talking to us, she would have her notes in front of her. And again, the sensate part, as she talked, she would literally touch each line of her notes as she went through it. Very linear, very sensory, very concrete, da, da, da. And we haven't talked about intuitive types, but intuitive types can take very non-linear paths, which can be real aggravating. They are very methodical, detail-oriented, and these folks are often the pillars of your community. They provide stability. They're incredibly grounded. They're very concrete. They are private, but they're the person who's always going to show up. They're the neighbor who always has the power tool that's working. And they know exactly where it is because they put it away in the same place every time, and it's going to be maintained and it's going to be ready to use. Like, these are the gifts, some of the gifts of this type. So Karen, and you work in a work environment. What are some of the gifts that you think you see in the folks that you're coaching?
I think the thing is, I talked earlier about honoring the past. I remember some people were so easy to throw away the past, but we know there's gifts in the past. I love that because that group remembers the past. Now, of course, there's challenges to that because they can't let go of the past, but the elements is to get the gems from the past. And I've been able to facilitate discussions where we pull out the gem, not everything, because it's the logical awareness of why they can't hold everything. But at least you're not like doing completely like avoiding everything and changing everything. Because I remember in the organization when they had the new VP who just said, you stunk, right? Like your past. They didn't even think about the past. We got to go a different direction, but you got to always honor the past some way because it's really critical to do because that's how you got so far here. I love what you said. They're dependable, stable, but again, their logic is really important. And I think that we tend to move so quickly, or I tend to move so quickly that I don't set the context. And I think it's important to set the context so you have a logical explanation for why we move from one way to the next way. It is really critical. So I love that because they will ask you logical questions so they can understand step by step. And it'll slow you down, which I think is good to do because you can't always do change so fast. You got to slow down so you're not missing anything. And I think that's one of the gifts that they bring is you may think that they're slowing you down, but actually the way I've been able to see it now is they're slowing you down so you can move faster. Like,
it's being thorough.
Yes.
It's
not slowing down. Exactly. It's being thorough. And then they catch things that you don't catch in regard to risks, because you're moving too fast, because it's always about speed, speed, speed. But in actuality, there's certain things when you open your ears to hear and be curious what they have to say, don't automatically knock them, right? That they're slowing you down. They're like entrenched. They're not about entrenched. It comes from somewhere, their intention of bringing it up. And that's what I've learned about the gifts.
This, Karen, when if you're a change management or you're a leader who's intuitive and trying to move forward and you don't understand this need and this way of processing and gathering that information, your information is going to be all about the future. We're going this way. Innovation is that way. We're going to be anticipating the client's need and we're going to be 10 steps ahead and da, 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 da. That's like blah, 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 ginger, blah, blah, blah. If you don't say, this is where we've been and this is how where we've been sets us up to move forward. This is how it creates this foundation that we are going to build this house upon, then you're going to get resistance.
Yeah.
And you have to, like you said, you called it context. But sometimes people give context and it's future oriented. What's really important is you have to start with how it associates to the past.
Right. And I think the best way that I've learned as a consultant, consulting to this group of people, is remembering to honor the strengths. Because the strengths that you take from an organization is typically honoring the past, right? And you start and you talk to them and you honor the strengths. And then you talk about the opportunities, which is the future, right? But you build on the strengths to show the connection between the strengths and then the other side, which is the opportunities. I think that's so much of a powerful way to honor the past by looking at the current organizational strengths, which makes a lot of sense, you know?
And it was really all of this difference that led me to the beginning of this journey of learning about it, because I was in an introverted sensate organization. It is the absolute complete opposite of my dominant.
Same with
So
me.
for me, it was 8 out of 8 steps away. And I was a subordinate. And here I came in as a multidimensional innovator. And I got in trouble. I was getting in trouble all the time. What is my gift was seen as boat rocking, because I didn't know, I didn't understand. And it was so disorienting, and it really affected my self-esteem because I didn't understand why I was getting in trouble. And I also couldn't understand. I could see what was coming down. The internet had just started to become available. And the way we had been doing work was incredibly wasteful. And I saw the potential of this new technology to not only do the work faster, but higher quality. And I couldn't understand why I couldn't break through. Why could they not understand it? One, this type is very hierarchical. So me as a junior consultant, first of all, in that hierarchy, who was I? I'm just supposed to do what I'm told. That was really hard for me. I'd never been in that kind of environment. So these differences can really have, when it's a big difference and it's really opposite of how you process it, it can definitely have an adverse effect. And it's the more I understood, I got to where Karen's talking about. I got to the point of having appreciation for the strengths of this. When before I just thought it was horrible. I was a defense contractor, and you also have a lot of folks with this type who are part of the defense community because, again, tradition, a lot of structure, it's all the things that are positive. And I gained so much respect for the men and women in these organizations and that understanding of the pillars of community, that it was very healing. I actually, my entire master's program, every single paper was focused on understanding this personality type.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so this is probably the one I have the most expertise on is this personality type.
And I think,
it's so
yeah, and I think one of the challenges you'll always hear, well, we do it this way, like it's how it's always done. And I think it's the ability to not hear that only and anticipate it over and over again. They're gonna say it, they're rigid, they don't like change. And then we start to label them, and that creates a difficulty, right? And
resistance. It's labeled resistance.
yeah, and we need to realize that. And when I started to be able to realize that it's not so much what they say, it's to dig and be more curious as to, so why was it done this way? And it could be very powerful that they had a reason why it was done this way, right? And maybe the why is more important than the how, right? And that's what I started to realize. And it's not that they're rigid, they're just knowing that it works right now, right? It's worked over the last 50 years. So why are we going to change, right? So it
Right.
allows you, and I think this is the whole point. You can't just assume new technology and stuff. And there are a little bit mistrust of innovation and novelty, but I am too, to be honest, sometimes, because I've been screwed, right? How many times have we had system implementation? Oh, this is the best sliced bread ever, right? And then it's like, no, my God, because the organization cared more about implementation than adoption. And that's the key thing is, we as change people and as leaders have to realize it's not about the implementation of new things, it's the adoption. And when you focus on the adoption, you're learning more about where these people are coming from so that you can help them adopt. And I think that's the biggest change that I've also learned, is not to dismiss it is to look and dive deeper and be curious about, how it's always done, or, I don't
Yeah.
like this. Because they may say, I hate this, but you need to explore why. And I think that's the whole point that I've learned a lot with working this group and this personality.
Yeah, so let me go over the challenges because Karen and I have both been change management consultants in organizations dominated by this personality
Yes.
type. So you can see how important, if you're a change management consultant, understanding this. But it's also important in understanding the fact that 46% of the population is this way. You can understand even politically a little bit about what's going on, where we're getting very polarized, where we're having what's called progressive. So progressives tend to be intuitive, looking in the future, wanting change, are clashing with a conservative point of view. People want to go back to the 1950s where it all felt safe and familiar and change that. Like, it is happening at a national level. It is really starting to influence us. And instead of us kind of understanding where that's coming from, it's like, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad. No, you're evil, you're evil. You're destroying the country. No, you're destroying the country. And we actually need all of our brain types. We need the diversity, and we need to learn how to respect each other and understand each other so we could be the best version of ourselves, the best version of our family, our organization, and even our community and our nation. But there are challenges we need to understand. So with this type, introverted sensing, that present to past focus, this type is more uncomfortable with change and spontaneity. Spontaneity can trigger some trepidation, anxiety, and like aversion. There's mistrust of innovation and novelty because there's no experience base for it. I had a manager, an introverted sensing with the extroverted thinking decision making. He said, when I hear something new, if he's like, I have boxes in my brain from my experience. If something new comes in, I look around for a box. If there's not a box, it goes right out.
That's interesting.
And they were having to go from the tradition of hierarchical to a matrixed organization. And we had to do a week of team building, working around all of these. My co-facilitator had to take this manager out in the hallway. She did give him the 1-2. But as he started to come to understand himself, he started to challenge his own anxiety. And he ended up going along and choosing this very innovative solution. But it worked. It took a whole week to get there. They could be rigid, what looks like rigid and stuck. When I'm saying rigid, it tends to be when confronted with novelty, it's like, I don't know what that is. Why should I move forward? This is how we've always done things. Why are we changing it? You haven't made the case for action, for change that's compelling. So it will look like being rigid, but they also like routines. Routines are comfortable. And the problem with that is that can lead to stagnation. That can lead to doing a process the same way because that's how it's always done. And it is now not efficient. Now it is causing problems. Now it is costing the company. So like what my company was doing when this technology is called Geographic Information System. It's a database. You put data in and it creates maps, very accurate maps using geographic data.
Okay.
And now that the internet had come on, I sound so ancient, like the birth of the internet in the 90s, the federal government was making all of this data available for free. Land use data, airspace, roads,
And people were
for national,
scared.
everything. It was all this. It was such an exciting time. What we were doing was we were scanning with a photocopy machine an image of a map and taking that scan, putting it into a Macintosh computer, and then our secretary would have to trace it in MacDraw to make our map. And we'd have all these scans. She's hand tracing with a mouse, tracing it, full of human error. You're trying to put where a town is on a map and you're tracing it. But the next map that you did, which had the national forest, well, it's not exactly the same scale. So she's kind of zooming in, zooming out, trying to line things up. It was just so riddled with errors. And it was not only time consuming for her, but then time consuming for us to go over it and find the errors and then send it back. And she would have to try to retweak it, and then we'd have to review it. 3 or 4 people being paid hourly wage. The client would be angry every time he would find problems, send it back. A GIS would have been perfect, seconds. And when I tried to introduce the technology and had a presentation done, and I knew that the boss was an introverted sensate. So I told the company, you cannot do a demonstration using like trucking. They won't make that leap to how this relates. You have to do exactly the data I give you. And it was so interesting because they did this great demonstration. All the non-introverted sensates could see the potential and were excited, but the VP was an introverted sensate. And what he was used to was we did our maps in landscape and the demo was in portrait.
And it killed it right away.
Yeah. And he kept saying, but we do it in landscape.
Yeah.
And the
and
guy
he couldn't
said,
get off of it. Exactly.
It was just how, you just select that when you print. Okay, but can you show me that? Because we do it in landscape. He just kept repeating, but we do it in landscape.
Yeah.
But I don't know, we do it in landscape. It was, I think I have no poker face. So I clearly look like, are you crazy? Yeah, this is why I didn't do well in this company.
But that's the whole point.
We didn't get it. We never bought the technology when I kept asking, and we had thought we had persuaded, and everyone was so excited, multi-platform, because we had Apples and we had PCs.
But we didn't
make
we
got it. We got it. He said, yeah, we got it. I'm like, oh, you did? Okay, where is it? Well, turns out he just bought a new clip art that had because that's what he knew was clip art. So it was wild.
Yeah.
So this is problem.
And I think that's the whole point where, you have to be intentional about your communications. That's the point of it, and to understand. And that's why asking and understanding is important. Like I've also learned when I have this type of client, I'm always reviewing what I'm doing with one or two, and then asking them to provide an example. So this way, it's not me coming up with an example, it's asking them to come up with an example of what we're trying to do, because it's more powerful because they can talk in that language. And I've been spending more time with them because we're developing the design of the workshop or something together, that it's easy for them to better understand because I'm going along with them. So I'm showing the logic of what I'm doing. So they're able to see it because I'm showing already the logic for them. So,
but Karen, what I'm telling you, when I'm talking about the challenges,
no, I know.
I did all of that.
Yeah.
I knew what was going to be like. No, you have to.
It doesn't matter in the end. Yeah.
Tracking. You've got to use our data. You can't use some other data. You can only speak to this. Do not speak to that. Only talk about these things. Don't talk about the potential down the. Stay away from that. And still, that one thing hung it up. Yeah. Oh, it's portrait, but we do it in landscape.
Yeah.
And this is that rigidity, that being uncomfortable with something I've not ever experienced. I don't have the experience base, and it could actually not cost the company money. It continued to have an angry customer. And ultimately, this division the determination was that whole company was no longer going to fund this division.
Oh, wow.
It completely collapsed. So the challenges for this personality type is developing cognitive flexibility, like becoming aware of this tendency for getting stuck and overly dependent on the past, and be aware of your anxiety and mistrust of the future. And this is where your growth edge is. You must acquire new experiences as part of your journey. You have to do a little bit of going in outside that comfort zone, because when you do that, you create a brand new box in your brain that will then serve you down the road in your natural state of going into the past experience. But you're going to have to be open to creating some new experiences that then will become your memory experience. So without it, not only is there a stuckness, but there's a blind spot around judgment. Anything new is bad.
Yeah.
And the other thing about this type, if you're dominant introverted sensing type, you need to understand that you are processing internally, and often there's a forgetting to bring it outward to share. So they do come across as extremely private. And it can be perceived as secretive.
Oh,
It can be
interesting.
perceived as stubborn. And all it is, it's an internal process, and I'm not really thinking about bringing it outwards and sharing what is going on inside and sharing it outside of me. And this can really be a source of a lot of judgment and misunderstanding. And I want to just kind of summarize that when you take the sort of the strengths and challenges together, we do find that these folks get drawn to certain types of careers. And some of the careers are finance,
Uh-huh.
again, that
That makes
conserving
sense.
resources, nursing, which is it's a very procedural, very methodical. So these tend to be the introverted sensing with feeling. Again, it's like pillar of society, being of service in an environment where it's always the same. We always do this way. A lot of teachers are drawn to this because you're teaching the same thing. You're teaching the foundations of language. You're teaching the foundations of math. You're teaching history. So teaching there, and there's a certain way you do it, and you create the lesson plan, and you use that lesson plan every year. So there's a lot of repetition. Also, the extroverted sensates also are drawn to teaching because there's a lot of classrooms now that are very probably overstimulating for introverted sensing. Conservation,
Hmm.
politics, conservative politics, the military, and law enforcement. Again, there's lots of structure. This is how you do it. It's guided by laws that we've all agreed upon, and our role is to maintain those traditions.
Now, Christina, as we are running out of time, when we focus a little bit, you said earlier about it's challenge yourself to reduce your judgment and to nurture your curiosity. What other things would you share regarding this as we close up this segment?
So, whenever we talk about these introverted processing functions, and we've talked about what introversion is, the orientation and attention is inside, it is so important to understand people outside of you have no idea what's going on in there. It is not apparent. And it is on the introverted processor in interpersonal relationships to make what is not apparent apparent. You have to be mindful about that. People can't read your mind. People aren't necessarily going to know what assumptions make sense for you because an introverted intuitive is different from an introverted sensate. It's different from an introverted thinking type, an introverted feeling type. You have to bring what's inside to the outside for better understanding. And I think that is just a key piece and takeaway that I want people to have.
Awesome. So, again, we want to thank everybody for tuning in. And we want you to make sure that you look at the resources below because I know that personality hack website is excellent because I've been exploring that more since we started talking more about this. And remember, we want you to subscribe, leave a review, share your comments below because it really helps us get the channel in front of more and more people. So until
Right
next time.
thing. Yeah. Thank you, Karen, and I'll see you all next time.